Welcome to the Dr. Stephen Greer podcast. I'm Michael Mazzola. I'm a filmmaker who has collaborated with Dr. Greer for many years. I'll be asking a few questions today. Dr. Greer, it's so good to be joined with you today. Where would you like to kick it off?
Well, first, I want to thank you, Michael, and all the people viewing this, and ask you guys to take the link for this and spread it all over the internet on your YouTube channels and X and Facebook, because we want to get the word out about these breaking developments as they evolve over this year in 2025. Everyone I'm speaking to in the U.S. government have indicated this is going to be the year of disclosure of all this coming out. It's going to start slowly and then pick up speed. There's just been the smallest tickling of that right now with some whistleblowers coming forward. There are a lot more in the wings. And then there are a number of activities that are to be determined depending on what the incoming Congress and administration will do. So just keep that in mind. And today we really want to focus heavily on the contrasts. And I would call this podcast military and corporate psionic contact with NHI versus CE5 contact. What's the difference? What are the distinctions? Why are those distinctions important? And why we want to do CE5 contact and not a militaristic contact. So I think people need clarity on that, because a lot of information has recently come out about the government programs about that. And by the way, you should get the CE5 Contact app. You can get it for your smartphones. It's a whole training program in consciousness, remote viewing, contact, all the protocols, how to form a team, the equipment you need, et cetera, and so on. So just remember that. Also, if you want one of these shirts, you can get them at our store. drstephengreer.com has a link to it. So a lot of people who are on CE5 teams like to have those, and it's just sort of fun. I'm wearing it today because I like blue. It's my favorite color. Yeah, it's totally my favorite color. It's what the Earth looks like from space, like this. So the Earth is so beautiful. And so first, let me lay the foundation of where my comments are coming from. And this is going to disturb a lot of people. So I'll give you a trigger warning right here. In 1991, I wrote a paper, which you can see in our first book, and we can actually, put the cover of this up on the screen. Extraterrestrial Contact, the Evidence and Implications. It came out in the 90s. And it's a collection of white papers and position papers on this subject. One of the early ones I wrote was the comprehensive assessment of the UFO/ETI subject, ETI being extraterrestrial intelligence, now called NHI, non-human intelligence. And in it, I go through a series of analyses. As soon as that hit the early internet, and it did, it got picked up by the aerospace industry and the agency, the CIA and others. And I heard from them directly. One of the people, who's a wonderful, wonderful man, Dr. Robert Woods, became one of our whistleblower witnesses in the early disclosure project. And he was worked with McDonnell Douglas, and in fact, had been tasked with Mr. McDonald, founder of McDonnell Douglas, to look into the ET technologies and including their psi capabilities and the technology and psi capabilities back in the 1960s. So when he read this comprehensive assessment, he found a section where I talk about consciousness interfacing with technology, and technology that can augment consciousness, where it goes both ways. And I called it TAC, technology assisted consciousness, and consciousness assisted technology, CAT. So there's TAC and CAT. I'll just use that from now on because it's short. It's a nice acronym. So TAC and CAT it's a two-way system where an individual's consciousness and mind and what we call coherent thought can interface seamlessly with very advanced electromagnetic systems that are phasing transdimensionally. In other words, beyond just the speed of light, and vice versa. And I had discovered this. This is perhaps more disturbing to most people. In 1973, when I was 18, so now I've known about this for 51 years, because I was 18 then, I'm 69 now. And I had a contact experience with non-human ET craft and individuals, because 6 months earlier, I had had an extraordinary near-death experience and then began to study, after I survived that physical catastrophe, what consciousness was and what the deep spirit of ourselves is. And I became a very avid student of consciousness, quantum entanglement, where everything's connected to each other through the mind, and began to do this. And then one night, one fateful night in October 1973, I'm up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I go up to meditate in this remote place up at about 5,200 feet up. And crystal clear day, gorgeous. And there was an ET craft that appeared before sunset in the southwest, close, and it materialized, came into 3D, and vanished. It was exactly the craft my twin sister and some boys in the neighborhood, when I was growing up in North Carolina near Charlotte, saw in 1963 when I was 8 years old. And so I just acknowledged them and didn't think more about it. And I said, well, that's interesting. They're back. And so I go into this very deep meditation. And at the end of it, I come out of this deep state, and I have an experience that was exactly like what I experienced when I died 6 months earlier in March of 1973, where I was, but at this point, instead of being out of my body in space, I was in my body on the ground, but where that state of unity consciousness, the oneness of consciousness that's infinite within all of us, I experienced while my eyes were open. And I thought, well, this is amazing. And this beautiful thought was sent to me. It said, behold, what a beautiful universe God has made. And the whole Milky Way was stretched over. I sort of became one with that. And the whole cosmos, while I was in my body. Now remember, this is 1973. I didn't have the knowledge I have now of either ETs, NHI, or even a deep study in consciousness or physics. You know, I had just come out of high school, right? And I was my first semester of college. So this was up in the mountains of North Carolina, by the way. But with that, I then realized that over the crest of the hill was a glow. And it was this craft I'd seen before I went into meditation. And all of a sudden, it didn't walk up, it just appeared, was a person who, in my young man's mind, I thought it was a deer standing on its hind legs, because it had beautiful almond-shaped eyes, and came over and touched. Now, I was wearing a kind of a ski jacket because it was cold. You know, you're up that high in October, and it was really a beautiful crystal clear front. It come in from Canada, you know, where it's chilly at night. And so it probably was in the maybe 30s, 40s. So I had this coat on. I could see the ET. It then became invisible and touched my shoulder, but I could see it indent the puffiness, and I could feel it touch. I could replicate it on you. If I were to touch you, I could tell you exactly the force of how it touched me, very firmly but gently. And with that, I dematerialized, went on a craft. Now, I thought that was about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. It turned out it was 3 or 4 hours. And that is when I studied and meditated with this group of NHI people to create what we now call the CE5 contact initiative and protocols. And that's what we're doing. And that's how it started. So that's the genesis of actual CE5 contact. Very different from what I'm about to talk about. Now, the reason I'm giving you this short summary, which you can read about this other places more thoroughly, I think in my book, Hidden Truths, Forbidden Knowledge, it goes into this in some more detail. But I'm not going to waste a lot of time on that. It's a beautiful story, actually. Now people say, oh, you were abducted. I said, no, I was contacted. And there's a big difference. So I had contact, not abduction. So it was a very amazing, beautiful, and like our special forces friend commented, it's overwhelmingly beautiful, and it's overwhelmingly loving and high consciousness. And it's just hard to put into words. That's why it's so emotional. That's real contact. The scary stuff is CIA. So if you haven't figured that out yet, I'm sorry, but you're 30 years behind the curve of what we've been disclosing. Now, so, hurry up. Catch up, slow-mo. I mean, this is the train's left the station. Now, here's the other part. So here's the other part of this. So time goes by. By the time I start this project in 1990, which is in itself another whole podcast, but we won't get into that. I want to address this because we'll run out of time. Okay, I'm going to skip over a whole lot of information that's really quite beautiful and amazing. I immediately decided that it was going to primarily be focused on contact peacefully with NHI ETs for the purpose of creating a interplanetary relationship and to create a civilization that will evolve from where it is now, isolated, fighting amongst itself, to peaceful and going out into space peacefully. And that was the sort of task I was given to do. So that's the genesis of CE5 contact. Very, very simple in a way. It's extraordinary to some people, but to me it's very clear and clean and direct and pure. So when I started the project, I started going to, I didn't know anyone anyone related to this subject. So I went to a couple meetings. I went to some UFO organizations annual conference in 1990 in the summer. Got intercepted by some CIA guys who somehow knew who I was, which I was obscure. I'm a doctor, trauma, emergency, and I said, well, how do you know me? But somehow I was on the radar. And then the following year, went to another one where the board of that organization pulled me in. They said, we're all either intelligence or former intelligence officials. I'm not going to say what the organization is, but you would all know it if I spoke it. So I said, well, that's fine. And they wanted me to be on the board. I said, no, I'm not interested. I don't want to be involved in that sort of thing. Right. And around that same time, a man approached me who was this old curmudgeon, brilliant, genius scientist in his 80s. But in 1956, now think about this, 1956, I was 1 year old. He had invented a very advanced electromagnetic system, like a headset that you could wear. And it would facilitate through very advanced electronics going into a state of consciousness where you could remote view, but also remotely influence places through consciousness and thought. And it was real.
So this was TAC.
Yes.
Man-made TAC.
Yes. This was man-made technology-assisted consciousness, but also it was consciousness that could assist or influence other technology or 3D objects. So it was both. And he offered it to me because he was going to die soon. He was probably in his mid-80s. So remember, this is 1991. He had admitted it in 1956 under spooky arrangements with the military-industrial complex. But remember, We started studying ET material and craft at least by the 40s, mid 40s. So that's 11 years on. And one of the projects was communications. Not everyone gets stuck on energy and propulsion, but there's a lot more, right? Now, when you start talking about trans-dimensional communications, interstellar, where you have to communicate across the vastness of space, you're going through the ultimate trans-dimensional switchboard known as mind, consciousness, in its non-local, expanded, infinite form. And this is why I tell people the operating system for CE5 contact, or for anything dealing with these civilizations, is understanding very deeply the science of consciousness, period. Now, of course, I've always been ridiculed for this, called a kook, called a quack, I don't care. You know, I'm sort of bulletproof for what you want to call me. But because I've been called everything over the last 35 years. But that is a fact. Now, that's coming out now with what they're talking about with these P3 and psionic programs. But I want to explain the stark difference, very stark. There are 180 degrees diametrically opposed. Now, eventually, I told this gentleman, I said, look, if I possess something like that, I'm quite sure I'll be killed. And I don't think that most people are at a level of higher consciousness where they can possess such a technology and not use it for selfish purposes. Because something like that is so powerful. Forget AI. This would be that on mega steroids, right? That is something that there has to be a certain evolution in human consciousness and peaceful consciousness. And I hate to use these old-fashioned terms, altruism and selflessness, before you possess that. Now, I would have been able to possess it and done no harm. But I don't think that that's something that, if you look at the fact that about 12% of humans are sociopaths, and within that category, there are a lot that are psychopaths, who usually become dictators and leaders around the world and CEOs of companies. That is not a great idea. Okay. So I said, thank you, but no thank you. And I'm glad to know that this exists, because it explains a lot of what I already had begun to experience by people approaching me from the intelligence community. And then a year later, approximately, I can't remember the month, in 91 that I met this gentleman. He's long since passed away. And by the way, the company, there was a front company that was a cutout fronting for the CIA that bought that technology, called Alpha Metric Corporation, is what he told me. I'm sure there's no trace of it. I'm sure it was something, an invisible shell company that absorbed it and then took it. But he still understood the science.
Alpha is an alphabet?
Yeah, Alpha Metric Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
So do with that what you will. So, I mean, that's 1956. I mean, you know, they can erase the records. If there's any track record of it, I'd be surprised. Nevertheless, I said, thanks, but no thanks, right? For the reasons I just explained. It's security and safety. I didn't think it was something that we were ready to do. And I knew it would put a big bullseye on us and on me. So, but he was a sincere guy wanting to help, because he thought this is what we should have always used this for, right? Is what you're doing, not what the military industrial complex, not what Lockheed and Northrop and Raytheon and the military people who are running covert programs using tech like this to target and down ET craft and kill them, right?
So you think, so they're using technology like this remote viewing assist to augment and amplify the psionics?
Correct. Yeah, the really high-end parts of it. So remember, all these projects are compartmentalized. If you are in one project, you might have been using one system. If you're in another, there may be another, a deeper one. You have to understand the extreme compartmentalization. So a special operator in one will absolutely not be read into something going on. It could be 10 miles away on another. They're just not. There's not this sort of all access pass on projects that's compartmented. Now, this is why I describe what we're doing with this podcast, the disclosure mosaic. I want to put together 35 years or more than that, since I was 18 years of this sort of experience and evidence and meeting these sort of officials and scientists, and give you this big mosaic, because it's time to pull all this together, frankly, because it's all going to come out. There has to be context and the understanding, not only the history of it, but also in that history are some warnings of what not to do going forward. That's what I want to speak to. So by 1992, because we had successfully invited, we don't summon and call or boss the ETs around. It's a diplomatic invitation. So let's get our linguistics down here. If you summon someone, you're at Downton Abbey, being the Earl of whatever, summoning the butler to bring you tea, right? We're not summoning ETs that way. We don't call them and they come at our beck and call. That is undiplomatic, it's demeaning, it's disrespectful, and it's the opposite of what we're doing with CE5 contact. That is not the consciousness behind it. The consciousness behind it is an invitation to make contact for peaceful relationship building between species, humans and non-human intelligence. It is not acquisitive. It's not to shoot them out of the sky with an electromagnetic pulse weapon, grab their technology, capture the living beings and put them under bases, or kill them. That operation is 180 degrees diametrically opposite of what CE5 contact teams are doing. I want to make this crystal clear, and I will say it 3 more times during the podcast. It couldn't be more different. And so people with their sort of superficial understanding of this can easily conflate those two, right? Couldn't be more different. They are absolutely not related. In fact, they are at complete opposite ends of what we should be looking at. So the one is an act of kinetic, militaristic, invasive, using psionics, violence, targeting of a craft, hijacking their control system. I'll get to this in a minute. I understand how it works. Moving them into 3D and into range, hitting them with a weapon, bringing them down, preferably in one piece, so they can be studied and reverse engineered. And sometimes the NHI people are killed. Sometimes they're caught living. Sometimes the ones that are captured are nanobiotechnological drones that are not the indigenous ETs, but ones that are very advanced. I've talked about this since the 90s, what is called nanobiotechnology, where you can have a living life form that's actually an operational being. And both ET civilizations have them for security purposes, but so do covert programs, by the way. And those are the guys, those creatures are the ones doing the abductions, the man-made drones or robots, but they're very sophisticated. I mean, some are kind of clumsy robotic and some are very biological. I've talked about this since the 90s. Now, the actual ET beings that often are on these craft, they often do get killed or they get captured. And I've been told by many of these special forces guys who've been in these bases that there's a number of them still in captivity, which they euphemistically call, I like the wordage they use, this to sort of whitewash what's going on, refugees. Well, they're not refugees. They've been captured and they're prisoners of these aggressive military and corporate programs. So those need to be liberated. And we're working on that through a group of special forces guys, which I can talk a little bit about. Now, the CE5 contact is not geared towards any self-aggrandizing purpose. It's not to give you entertainment because you saw a UFO. It's not to get their technology so we can reverse engineer it and then beat the shit out of the ETs with it, which is what the military and corporate programs have done for 70 years. It's to make peaceful contact and develop a deep relationship between humanity, our species, and their civilizations, plural, of which there are many, for going forward in a time of not just world peace, but universal peace. That's why our motto is one universe, one people. And the foundation of universal peace is not shooting each other out of the sky so we can be the big monkey and figure out how to get their technology. That's not it. It's to create a future where we do have the technologies. We already have them. We don't have to keep shooting them down. That would run the planet with 0-point energy and free energy and no pollution, and in a generation eliminate all the suffering and poverty on the planet. Create huge new advances in medical healing systems, all kinds of positive things. And the ETs want that. But we don't have to kill them. We don't have to capture them. We don't have to hijack their aircraft, their NHI craft, and we most certainly don't have to hit them with weapons to bring them down. This is not the way to do this. Absolutely not. It's immoral. It's dangerous. Now, let me pivot for just one moment. This will disturb you. You may not sleep tonight. And I've known this for some time. But in the last 2 years, I've had 3 separate people who have been in communication centers at classified bases that have told me there has been intercepted communications from NHI, that they're just about fed up with that nonsense of us targeting them, damaging them, captivating their people, and doing this in a kinetic, meaning violent. Kinetic is another euphemism in the military. Just kinetic is just, casualties and destruction, violence manner. And then that the problem is, because we have these advanced technologies that are psionic and technological, our craft, the ones that we have that are man-made, have pretty much reached almost an indistinguishable level with the NHI craft or ET craft. But by using this technology in an aggressive military and corporate way to simply get more and more of their stuff, their goodies, their technology, which is what all the billionaires want, right? Because they only think one way. How do I become a trillionaire if I'm a billionaire? That's all they care about, right? These civilizations out in space are absolutely fed up with that. And let me be clear about this. This is a warning and it is a threat. If we stay on that path much longer, the dangers to peaceful civilizations out in space and other transdimensional space-based civilizations is that it is untenable. So we're at a crisis and we have to fix it. And the way we're going to fix it is to stand down completely those aggressive weapon systems. Now, one of the executive orders that I have recommended to the incoming president and the Congress is an immediate cessation of the use of those systems that target, bring down these craft through a forced effort as opposed to peaceful contact. So we need to take that sword and all those tools they have, but turn it into this plowshare of open, peaceful contact without the ulterior, selfish motive of let's steal and reverse engineer more of their tech. We've already done that. It's been done for 70, 80 years. We don't need to recreate that wheel. We need to disclose the technologies that already are existing, that are to be used peacefully, not the things that fly, but the energy generation. But we don't need to go from one legacy program to something that would be equally misguided and would be using technologies that are psi-related aggressively or in a way that is forced. There should be no more forced takeover of the craft, and there should be no more striking of them with any type of electromagnetic weapon. So that needs to be done by an executive order and a law passed through Congress, and then it has to be enforced. And the way it's going to be enforced are the special forces guys who've separated from the military are now ready to work under a law enforcement team in the United States, and there's another team being stood up that could operate overseas. So I'm involved with briefing them, and I'm involved in trying to get them up to speed. But they can't act. My friends, listen. We live purportedly in a democracy. They can't act unless the president and the Congress acts, and because then they would be unconstitutional and rogue, right? So, which they don't want to be. They want to operate under the rule of law and the rule of the Constitution. So we need to write our leaders and explain, please pass the executive orders that Dr. Greer has provided in the presidential briefing document and the briefing document for Congress. Soon, we're going to publish that entire document, except with certain redactions for sensitive reasons that everyone listening and everyone in the world can read, and it'll be a page turner. It's 310 or 20 pages, something like that. So that's what we need to do. I just wanted to get all that put together quickly in a package. And then what you were going to ask something, Mike?
Yeah, I got two questions. The first one is, when you say that this is a communication, an extraterrestrial communication that was intercepted, is this an ET communication to another ET civilization that we eavesdropped on, or
yes,
is this
correct?
Real? Okay, can you elaborate on that?
Well, look, I mean, if you understand space-time at a trans-dimensional level, and you understand the physics of the interface between what we would call electromagnetics and thought conscious fields, psionic, TAC and CAT, you can set up systems that can receive that kind of data. And apparently that has happened. And people say, well, is it in English? I said, it doesn't need to be, because this gets into something we don't necessarily have time to go into, but there's a pre-verbal level. So let's say, I'm going to say a word. Apple. No. Red apple. Now, those English words, red apple, doesn't mean anything to someone who speaks Swahili or Mandarin if they don't know English. But inside those words is the image, the essence of a red apple. Let's call that the visual aspect of it. And within that is the causality, the meaning of the thought. All right? It's called causation at thought level. And that is where real communication happens. It's in those packets of the thought essence. And then it can go into the visual and or specific language. So I want to unpack that. That's what we do with our CE5 contact when we're receiving information. So this is very advanced concepts. I mean, I know this is going to lose people here. This is why, you know what? We're going to do a whole week cruise on a ship in the middle of the Caribbean. 200, by the way, that's sold out, but they can only take 200 people, but you can join us by webinar, although we may have some dead spots in the ocean, but that's April, I think, 6th through the 12th or something. But
I'll put the link up on the screen.
Yeah, it'll be so cool. But because we've never done it in the middle of the dark ocean. Every night we'll be out in the middle of the dark ocean. It'll be phenomenal.
I've always wanted to do CE5 in the middle of the ocean.
Me too.
Near an ET base.
Yes. Well, yes. Yeah. And you're further away from a lot of the assets to strike them. So now, one other little bit here. Mm-hmm. If you look at the CE5 contact protocol, the meditation, the protocol, embedded in it, usually more than once, is for them to come and appear in any way that is safe and appropriate for this time and place and situation. And I communicate to them and say, we have these weapon systems, you can be tracked, and they can strike you. So heads up. Because what we don't want to do, since we now have millions of people around the world that know about CE5, right? Everyone from Aaron Rodgers to Demi Lovato to celebrities to what have you. But the reason that's important is that I've known since 1991 that they have had these capabilities to track them and strike them. The reason I was offered $2 billion by General Albert Stubblebine III, Bert, in May of 92, and my wife, who's over here, is not, we talked about this earlier today, who said, oh yeah, is because they knew that I understood this and I could be a valuable asset. Now, at the time, I had a hint of that, but it wasn't so clear. And I said, no, thank you. Now, most people, here's the problem, who know what I'm talking about, if they gather together somewhere with a bunch of billionaires who are carrying water for, say, a new entity for these covert programs, they're going to say, wow, really? You can put $5 billion into this, huh? Yoo-hoo! I go, sit on it, rotate, right? That's what I said to the general. I said, no, this is a corrupt situation. Yeah. So excuse me for being vulgar, but no, I'm that kind of guy. I said, I am not going to deviate from the purpose of what we're doing because you offer me 5 pieces of silver instead of 1. I'm not interested. So that is difficult because the path I've chosen is a path of relative impoverishment for my projects. Why we only have 1.5 staff members. We should have 50. No office, and have been stripped bare of any real capabilities because I'm not willing to corrupt the purpose, you see. I'm not willing to sell out. I'm not a sellout. It's also why I refuse to take a clearance. In other words, all these meetings I've taken, I have never signed an NDA, and I will never. So I've been asked to be in positions where I'd have to have one. I said, I'm not interested. I'm not going to be your tool. You're not going to put me in those shackles. All right. So that's just my philosophy. Everyone has their own role in life. My role in life is to stay out of that. But I do want to tell people who are doing CE5 contact, and everyone listening should start doing it, because when more people do it, here's the beauty of consciousness. 1 and 1 is equal to 10. It's not equal to 2. There is an exponential power of people coming together with a clear consciousness in this higher state of mind, in the meditative state, doing this, that actually alters the course of everyone on Earth, but it sends this beautiful signal out to the non-human civilizations that there are people willing to engage with them for the correct reasons, not the reasons of greed and get their technology and shoot them out of the sky and all the dysfunctional stuff that is the worst of humanity. So there's this other part of humanity that's spiritual and beautiful and forward-looking and wants to carry an ever-advancing civilization forward that isn't based on war and destruction and endless poverty and endless war. That's what the ETs are looking for. Those are the people they're looking for, right? And that you don't have to be in the U.S. government or in a covert program to do that. On the contrary, those people have to sort of totally become re-educated and have their consciousness totally evolved in another direction. Whereas the average person on the street is absolutely ready to do this. This is why the CE5 Contact Initiative is a grassroots. And where I kept it that way. I was advised during the Clinton years, make it a closed elite group, like these elite strike team groups, right? And do it only with a handful of elite people who think because they're rich or powerful, that they should be part of this, but the man on the street shouldn't. And I rejected that. I said, no, this needs to be something where the whole of consciousness of humanity moves in that direction of this beautiful future.
Dr. Greer, I have a really important question for you.
Yeah.
So I guarantee you there's people listening to this right now who are hearing you say, the ETs have drawn a red line in the sand, and if this goes much further, they're not going to put up with it, and they're going to come here and they're going to intervene. And the people hearing this are saying, oh, fantastic, finally, that's exactly what we want. That's what we've been waiting for. So we don't have to do anything. The ETs are going to come and solve it for us. So could you please explain why we really do not want this to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that intervention externally by NHI is a worst case scenario, the very worst, because there are already predispositions in human nature to believe that would be a violent invasion, alien invasion. Go look at War of the Worlds. Go look at Independence Day. Those movies were, basically showing what a sort of more frontal, forced disclosure by the ETs would be interpreted as. But beyond that, the whole media, not to mention the UFO world, has already been predisposed to believe that, because beginning in the late 50s and early 60s, once we mastered gravity control and had our own ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, reverse engineered man-made craft, and we started doing the stagecraft, as it's called, of mutilations and abductions, blowing up villages in Africa and South America, everything that we've disclosed about this, it has caused the human consciousness to be predisposed towards the ETs being a malevolent force coming to invade us. Now, these special forces guys coming forward are saying, no, they're absolutely not. The experiences they've had is the most beautiful. The real ET experiences are indescribably beautiful in consciousness and in heart. The problem is the general public has already been brainwashed, because these psychological warfare operations known as PSYOPs that were launched in the 50s are now, 65 plus years in the making. So they've had 2/3 of a century to embed in the subconsciousness of humanity that an alien present is a priori malevolent or demonic or something horrible, and they're coming to invade us. So that's all disinformation. But humans have a proclivity to believe it. Why? Because that's what we do to each other. That's what the Holocaust was. My grandmother was Cherokee. Look at the Trail of Tears. Talk about a Holocaust. This is man's inhumanity to man. We are already conditioned that one more powerful group interfacing with a less technologically advanced group is going to dominate them and destroy them. This has been our human collective conscious experience for thousands of years. So we're both innately predisposed to this, but on top of that, they have staged all these horrible, frightening events, which everyone from the president on down think are actually NHI.
Right.
Most of the special forces guys, remember, all these special forces guys have worked in extremely narrow compartmented operations as tactical operators or whatever they were. They don't know what's going on in all these other compartments. This is the disclosure mosaic we have to put together, that I'm trying to do, so that there is some context to understand why the decisions are that we have to fix this problem ourselves. The worst case scenario is that the NHI craft and ETs fix it, because it will, no matter how benign their intentions, it will be misinterpreted by and misportrayed by the corrupt corporate media, governments, and the secret organizations that are criminal, that this has been their long-term plan. And Werner von Braun in his deathbed said, the big plan that's going to happen, this was 50 years ago in 1974, and said to Carol Rosin, is that the big long-term plan is to present a threat from outer space that's alien, so we can unite the world around this totalitarian, militaristic superstate. That they've spent trillions of dollars preparing people for. And we have to say no to that. So there has to be this mass human awakening to the truth about the issue, as opposed to the false narrative. The big risk of disclosure at all, and I've known this for a long time, is that the minority opinion is going to be what I just said. The majority are already brainwashed to believe the worst. And this you see in comments from members of Congress. You see this from people who are very close to the incoming administration. people like Tucker Carlson who says, well, these are demons. I was recently on a podcast for Charlie Kirk, who is a religious person, very religious person at Turning Point USA. And I was asked that question. And I said, let me quote Monsignor Balducci, from the senior theologian for Pope John Paul, when I was at his at the Vatican with him. And he said, neither angels nor demons need flying saucers.
That's right.
Right. So people, because all this different phenomena, plural, extra dimensional, other dimensions, NHI, it all gets mixed together. But the CIA and other people who are players in this want that confusion. And in that confusion, they can drive their narrative. So, and that narrative leads to what? World War III. It leads to an interplanetary conflict. And that is an extinction level event by any measure. When you're not talking about nuclear weapons, we're talking about our species trying to fight another.
Well, isn't that what would happen if the ETs were to be provoked into an intervention? It's not like the people running these programs who are sitting on technology that has reached parity with the ETs. It's not like they wouldn't put up a fight, right? So we'd be talking about a massive battle.
Actually, they would not need to do that, and they wouldn't do that. I mean, although we have assets that would make that look like what they're doing.
Got it.
They would instantly all these systems could be shut down. People have no idea what those capabilities are. It's people look at too much science fiction. This is not Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever. That leave that in Hollywood, all right, in someone's basement, where we fabricate all this nonsense. If you understand a little bit about those capabilities, it'd be point, set, match in a fraction of a second. So that's not going to happen that way. What's more likely, however, is that we would then trigger our own man-made craft and creatures that are man-made to engage in all kinds of violent activity. And this they're planning to do anyway. See, this is the other problem. The long-term plan has been to take all these fleets of man-made UFOs, because trillions of dollars, and Lockheed Skunk Works and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and SAIC and Booz Allen Hamilton and EG&G, all these big corporate contractors for these covert NHI retrieval craft operations. Over 70, 80 years, they've had massive breakthroughs beyond what you can imagine. And so that's why one of our whistleblowers, and when I was doing the briefings for Congress in 1997, he was taken out of the hotel the night before the congressional meetings and taken to a secure location, quote unquote, out in Virginia. And but before that, he had met with us and said he had been on an interagency committee where they could hit a button. This is 1974. He was on this committee 50 years ago. We can hit a button, he said, and all of a sudden the skies are going to fill up with man-made ET craft, UFOs. No one's going to know where they are, and they can engage and start doing violent activities, and it will fool everyone in the U.S. government and every government around the world, never mind the press and the media. That's why they started right before all this, right before the new administration, they started doing all this crazy drone stuff. They're sort of giving a little warning. We can start launching all kinds of stuff. And that was nothing. That was just, buffoonery by comparison. So we know what their capabilities are. I do, for a fact. I've seen them. So that's the real danger, which is why, let's pivot back to a point I made a moment ago. It's very important that the current administration, now that they've just come into office on Monday, and the new Congress, move quickly to issue directives to get those sort of capabilities that are human under proper control. Because if they're not, they can launch that false flag operation. Some people call it Project Bluebeam. That's not a term I've heard from any legitimate operative, by the way.
Is there a code name to it that you do know of?
No.
Okay.
No. Excuse me. So, but look, if I have that information, when I have it, I share it. If you dredge the stuff off the internet, I ignore it. Remember, I have 765 whistleblowers I've dealt with over the years that I've debriefed and gotten information from. Firsthand people, like the guys just coming forward. They're and by the way, what they're sharing about, people forget, in 2001, we did the National Press Club, and we had people there who were on the retrieval teams in the 60s doing precisely what these guys are talking about having done in the 2000s. It's the same thing. So, the only difference is that group possesses, but are not yet releasing, a tranche of dispositive evidence that are located in secure sites. I don't have them. They didn't want me to have them because they thought I'd be killed. They're very sweet. They honestly feel that if I possessed that, I'd be dead. So, and I appreciate that. I mean, people, there's a real sweetness among some of them. I mean, they've been very hardened guys. A lot of them have PTSD and other things from their careers, but they're actually incredibly sweet to me, and they've been very kind in many ways. So, and I appreciate that. I'm not trying to blow off the risk of that, because look, I mean, they do have wet work assassination teams. They go after people that have something that's too hot. And what I was told by those guys, we don't want you to hold this hot potato. It's too dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Dr. Greer, to round this out, I have one last question.
Sure.
Just to give clarity to people about CE5, has anybody ever been injured or harmed in any way during a CE5?
Mm-hmm. Oh no! I mean, one of the interesting things is, if you're a special forces operator in a very narrowly construed task, you're not going to know the whole, constellation of what's going on. You're not, because you're not going to be. No one has that kind of all access clearance. I've had to put that all together by debriefing nearly 1,000 whistleblowers, right? And being in facilities and seeing these things over 35 years. So, no. And in fact, the injuries that have happened have all been done at the hands of man-made technologies masquerading as alien. Or you don't know what it is. You're out there to pick something up. Now, there are a lot of people who have had terrible injuries. I don't diminish Cash Landrum, those poor victims from that event in the 80s, where there was that test flight of a craft that was ET in origin, but had a nuclear power plant on it that malfunctioned and was spewing radioactive waste on Cash Landrum, this little 5-year-old boy and his mom and his aunt. That event was a total man-made, but covert programs were very happy for the UFO echo chamber of people with no knowledge to say it was alien. Well, it wasn't. There were 4 human pilots on that, and it was a man-made plutonium thing. So what people need to realize is that whether it's a violent abduction, a mutilation, human experimentation, animal mutilation, human mutilations, these are all being done by humans. Anyone who's had actual contact with the ETs, NHI consciousness, including these special forces guys, they speak of it in the opposite direction. Now, on the other end of it, so let me put this in perspective. I have been doing CE5 contact for 51 plus years. Never been injured, never had a bad experience. I have been on expeditions with thousands of people that I've led all over the world. We've had the most beautiful experiences. No one's ever been injured. But there are many, many people who've been healed. You look at the CE Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind movie, and Ed Moen. He had since he was a teenager, he couldn't hear at all, barely, even with hearing aids. And when we had that contact with what the ET, we can put this picture of up called the Healer. then he continued to connect to that being throughout the night. He woke up the next morning totally healed, because he didn't go there to be healed. He was there sincerely as an ambassador. We call these people ambassadors to the universe. But at the end of the night, he had to go to bed, and it became this beautiful red light sphere. And he asked, "Could you do something with I just can't hear what Dr. Greer's saying and what the group's saying." The next morning, he woke up completely healed. Now, I can tell you a dozen stories like that more over the years. So far from being injured, the CE5 participants have often, not that they're going there for that ulterior selfish purpose, but they often will, if they're in a pure enough heart and they make that connection with the ETs, they will have extraordinary hearing. I mean, we're talking people with, I had one man who had multiple back surgeries, chronic debilitating back pain for all of his adult life. And we were in the circle doing the meditation. There was this beautiful ET vehicle that transdimensionally enveloped us. And that night, he was healed, never had any back problems. We had a member of our team who had a really bad knee. And one night after we had been out, and this was a couple of years ago in Joshua Tree, and she was in her room after we had our post CE5, what we call conviviality and babitas. And we have I call it our circle of love and dysfunction, where we have a little party at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. You know this, Michael. I mean, I like to have fun. If you don't have fun doing this, you're going to eat your gun. It's that simple. So, and so she, late at night, she said had been earlier that night, these 2 ETs, you can see a picture of it, that looked like these conehead ETs sitting in our chairs. We'd gone inside because it was so cold. It was like 18 degrees in Joshua Tree. It was this freak cold front that came through. So that night at the end, she said she connected to in consciousness telepathically to those ETs and said, "God, my knee is really killing me." And all of a sudden there were 3 beautiful blue spheres that were outside her patio door from her room. And they came in. And then she was almost like put in sort of a peaceful anesthesia. And she said she just laid down and went to sleep. And when she woke up the next morning, they had done some kind of work on her knee, and it was totally fixed. So I could tell you the story. We don't have enough time to tell you all these stories. Mm-hmm. And so I just tell people, and remember, I was supposed to die in 1996 and 97. I had an electronic warfare system put a terrible, aggressive, metastatic cancer on me. And I was healed. I mean, well, I'm still here, right? Because it was the deadliest of all known cancers at the time back then. But so I tell people, we're here for a reason, and we do this without fear, and we do it for the right reason. And we have to free our mind from the commingling of the false narratives of fear and injury from the truth. And the truth of dealing with NHI, ET civilizations, their craft, is very beautiful. But because most people don't have enough information to distinguish between the man-made ones and the NHI craft and people, they're going to be completely deceived. And this is what the purpose of this podcast is to provide that perspective, that information, that knowledge, and ultimately the wisdom of saying, okay, how do we go from where we are now in this very broken world and create a new world? And I want to end with this interesting thing. You know, one of the little clips that they let out was this craft that looked like an egg. And that's a very well-known shape, by the way. It's not the only one. There are hundreds of different craft and shape and sizes. And they're not very big, 20, 30 feet. Some are bigger. And back in 1978, and I was in the Middle East, and I had this most amazing lucid precognitive dream because I tend to have those, have dreams of the future that are crystal clear. And when I have one like that, I know it's real. And I was much older, and it was in the future. And I was at a place that looked like white sands, although at that time I'd never been there. Really white sand, but it's not actually sand. It's feldspar. I forget what the mineral is. And at that time, the entire U.S. government and military had been transformed from the sword attacking these craft to a force making peaceful contact doing CE5, but with the full support of the military and the government. And out of a crystal clear blue sky with all the cameras of the world filming it, I was there with a team, a diplomatic team, and an egg-shaped, you can't believe this, an egg-shaped craft descends from a blue sky, materializes, comes down, comes and hovers right there, and an ET elder comes out, a very ancient ET elder, in a open event like that was not the military shooting them down and capturing them, but a true peaceful ambassadorial contact.
What did he look like?
Well, he looked like not too different from us, but very, very. Now, this could have been my young boy. Well, I was 22 then. This could have been some of me extrapolating on it just to make it relatable, right? When you get these conscious, the only thing that's completely pure in consciousness is God and the Supreme Being. Certainly not me, but to the best of my recall, it was like a old man Moses or some depiction of like that, but a very ancient, and in some kind of a tunic or robe that came out. But obviously a very senior spiritual and ambassador from these civilizations. But it was like literally the whole world was seeing this simultaneously. So I share that vision to say, perhaps we're at this inflection point with all the madness and misunderstanding and lack of direction, that we can go from where we are now, which is very fraught and dangerous, to that. And that's the vision. I want you to, that's the vision that's the vision that has to guide the world, I think. We have to look at that beautiful future, not a dystopian future of endless conflict with scary aliens, because that's not what it is.
Thank you, Dr. Greer. And you opened this podcast by talking about your original book, Contact.
Yep.
I can't urge people strongly enough to read this. You might be thinking, oh, it's 30 years old, it's out of date, it's irrelevant. But the truth is, you can accumulate all the data and all the sightings that you want, but if you don't have a worldview and a framework and context to interpret that data, you're going to keep getting fooled. You're going to keep reaching the wrong conclusions. And that book, more than anything else, gave me the framework to understand what's happening now, almost 30 years after you wrote it. So I can't recommend it strongly enough to everybody.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll be doing these every week or so, and sometimes more when there's breaking news that I need to address. So share this with everyone in your network, because this is how we get the word out. And I appreciate everyone's support. And if you want to do a deep dive on more of this information, you can go to dpiarchive.com. It's the Disclosure Project Intelligence Archive. It's got years of study in there. There's so much in there, but you'll be amazed if you start poking through that, how much you're going to uncover. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.